It's January 9th, 2017, and we will call this workshop to order with a flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I believe we're going to be, I'm going to hand this over to Gina so she can talk to us about the Capital Levy Committee.
So we have Mark Pressing, who is the financial advisor for the school district, who is Skyping in to go through the financial outlook for a capital levy in response to the board's request. He did make an attempt to get on the road from Hood River today and had to turn back around, so we've invited him via Skype. So is he online, Sandra? So in the board docs, we provided the overview of the report that he'd be going through.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Are we ready for?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. I'd introduced you, but welcome. So basically, you can take over and go through your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sandra offered to flip the pages for me since I can't do it myself. So I can just go to the first one, the picture of me driving today. So I really appreciate the accommodation of allowing me to Skype in and use this new technology. My background with Othello School District, I believe, Gina, I've worked with the district since about 2004 on bond-related matters, and most recently worked with the refunding, and now my current position, I work with Educational Service District 112. And in conjunction with our construction services group, I help districts with their capital facilities funding and bond-related questions. And so again, thank you for letting me not finish my drive today. I drove for about an hour. And Dr. Hurst, I understand snow is a little bit newer to you, so you might appreciate the experience of driving through some of this stuff. When they said change are required, I decided it was time to call it quits. So just to jump in, Gina asked me to attend your work session to do a couple of things. One, to have just a quick review of some capital funding options and steps, and then also to look at some potential options for some of the district facilities that you're considering. So generally, this is kind of an iterative process where you have a list of projects you want to accomplish, and we look at what the tax rate implications would be of that and other considerations. And then we go through a process of a number of iterations again to come up with something that you feel best meets the current needs, or the needs that you want to accomplish with the funding measure, and that you believe would be affordable and that the community would support. So I think it's probably one of the first steps in that process. I just jump into the slide with the discussion topics. So I want to review the capital funding sources typically used by Washington schools, and then some of the different funding options that I was asked to consider, and then where we'd go from here. So I'll move down to my presentation here and see if I can catch it on my side. So typically, again, with the funding steps, is you develop the project priorities, determine state matching funds that are available for that, and develop the project costs associated with that. Then what falls out, of course, from that is the local share, the amount that you're asking voters to approve property taxes for, either to pay capital levy dollars or to pay for debt service on a bond issue. We then refine the scope of projects, go through the iteration I talked about before, and you reach out to the community. And then eventually you're going to take action on an election resolution for either a capital levy or a bond issue that's prepared by your bond counsel. In this case, it's Foster Pepper, Jim McNeil. And then after that, it passes by the voters, and you have bond sales if you do a bond levy versus a capital levy. So moving to the next page, review the typical funding sources. Of course, state assistance, the school construction assistance program, varies by district, and your unhoused students. It's quite frankly a formula that I don't understand very well. It's fairly complicated, but the people at our construction services group work with districts a lot in determining what state matching funds are available. Again, I work primarily with the bonds, and bonds are the most common method for financing schools in the state of Washington because of a couple of things. One, you generate cash up front. The payments can be spread over a longer period of time, and what I call a taxpayer equity. And what I mean by that is most often the facilities that you're looking at are going to last for 20 to 25, 30 years or more. And so by having bond issues that are most typically structured with a 20 to 25 year repayment plan, you're spreading those payments over the useful life of the project, and then allowing the taxpayers that live in the district during those period of time to use those facilities to help pay for those facilities. And the other reason bonds are more popular than capital levies, which we'll get into a little bit more, is you have a little bit more control over the taxpayer cost over time, and you can use your bonds to structure around other funding priorities, for example, technology levies and M&O levies and those sorts of things. So move forward to the next page. Under bonds, there are really two main classifications of bonds. One would be voter-approved bonds, which is typically what you'd think of as, and it's called the unlimited tax general obligation bond. That's how we refer to that. And the general obligation means that they're secured by property taxes for properties of the district. So investors like that. The fact that you can collect property taxes to make payments on the bonds make them much more secure for investors, and they're going to give you a lower interest rate on the bonds if they're backed by property taxes. They do, however, require 60% yes vote for voter approval in the state of Washington right now. That may change in the future, but I've been hearing that for 20 years, so I wouldn't count on it anytime soon. You have a debt capacity, the maximum amount you can borrow, and I think these topics are familiar to you, 5% of the assessed value of the district. We'll review that a little bit more when we get into some of the options that we're looking at. And the bonds have a maximum maturity of 40 years, but typically, like I said, are 20 to 25 years is the most common repayment term. For non-voted bonds, you'll see people use non-voted bonds for things like property purchasing when you can't get voter approval right away, but you need to purchase some property, you need some debt associated with that. You'll also see people that have a capital levy in place want the money up front, so they'll borrow the money at the beginning of the capital levy and then use the capital levy dollars to repay the debt, so you can get the projects going earlier. One constraint with that, or two big constraints with that, is one, you can't use the capital levy dollars to pay interest. So any interest on the bonds has to come from an existing district source or the general fund. The other one that probably be a big constraint in your case is you can't use it to fund new construction. It can really only be remodel, refurbishing, those sorts of things for non-voted bonds. And your debt capacity for non-voted debt is much lower, 3/8 of 1%, not the 5% that we for the voted bonds. And there's some additional public hearings required for non-voted debt, but I don't think it'd be very important to this. So, and again, I'm kind of flipping through this quickly, but please feel free to interrupt me. I can see you, so if you raise your hand or speak out, I'd be happy to take questions along the way as well. We can do that. So moving into the capital projects levy, you can collect the capital projects levy for 1 to 6 years. There's no interest cost, which is a real benefit. You get a 50% voter approval, which is a real benefit. But then again, it's a potential life cycle mismatch that you'd have. We're talking about that you'd have a facility lasting longer, paying for it for a shorter period of time. And then again, you can't use any capital levy dollars to pay interest on non-voted debt. So that's some of the constraints on capital projects levies. And just a review to the next page on some of the math, and these are fairly straightforward, but I like to throw them in there just to make sure we're talking about the same terminology. On the tax rates and assessed value, the tax rate is essentially the dollars levied either for debt service or for capital levy divided by the assessed value of the district times 1,000. And the bond assessed value is your real and personal property plus a timber value at 100%. The last time I was in Othello, there wasn't a lot of timber out there. So I'm guessing timber value isn't going to affect your assessed value much. And then the levy value is a little bit different with timber, but yours would be the same there again. And I will say that we're looking at right now is when we're starting to get the new assessed value for the district for 2017. We don't have that yet, the full value, but we can update some of the numbers that we'll look at once we receive the full assessed value. Because you can see with that equation, if you have the dollars levied divided by the assessed value, the biggest thing that's going to determine your tax rate is what your assessed value is. So we'll want to revise any information tonight over time when we get that new assessed value. So going into your funding options a little bit on the next page, the first thing you want to look at is the debt capacity. Again, at the 5% of the assessed value, we're projecting with the 4% growth or in your assessed value for next year, be 2017 so the current year, you have about $41.3 million in debt capacity. So that's one of the constraints we'd be working around. And on the next page, we'll show just over time how that would change. In 2018, you'd have 45.3 essentially of debt capacity, and then it increases over time as your assessed value grows and as you pay off your existing debt. So I know some of these numbers are kind of small in your presentation, but it's essentially the way it works is it's your 5% of your assessed value, subtract your existing debt, and your non-voted debt would be included in that as well. And then the balance is what you'd have available to issue for debt capacity.
Is the 4% number you're using?
Yes.
That 4% growth rate, is that just an average that you use everywhere, or is that based on some kind of theory that our property taxes our assessed value is going to grow more than it has last year?
That's about what it did last year. Is a little bit lower than that. I think last year 2.8%. So it's really a number that we use, as an assumption. And happy to run some numbers with different numbers, but it's really not based on any crystal ball. You'll see in the growth going forward, we say kind of short term 4%, and the longer term move it back to a 3% growth for calculating your debt capacity. And I have worked with districts that have approved bond issues that exceeded their debt capacity. You can't sell the bonds until that debt capacity, until your assessed value grows, essentially, or you pay off some of your debt. It's not real common, but it is done, and it requires just a little bit different messaging for us to the community of how you can approve a bond authorization that exceeds a district's debt capacity. And I've had another district, a couple of, but one in particular, in that the west side, assessed values dropped so quickly, they actually went over their debt capacity just because their assessed value dropped so fast. And it took them 5 years to get back to be able to the point where they could issue any bonds. So the assessed value is really an important factor that we'll want to consider as we move forward. Going on to the next page, these really don't matter too much this evening, but we talked about your non-voted debt capacity to 3/8 of 1%. Then your bond ratings are what we look at as well. The rating agencies want to make sure you're managing your finances effectively, that you're managing your debt effectively. But also they look at the local economy. So they think that there's kind of two categories: the things you can control, and that's what you all are in charge of controlling. And then there are things you can't control, so more of the district economy, assessed value, and employment, and population base, those sorts of things. That's something over the long time we work with, and we worked with Gina on the last refunding issue to renew the district's credit rating of A1, which is a very good, strong credit rating. So the next page, we'll look at some of the key inputs that we put into the analysis that we put together. One is that assessed value grows out at 4% again through 2022. And again, there's no magic to that number, but we'd hope that's what the district would. If we want to bring that back a little bit, of course we could. Gina asked me to consider a new capital projects levy at $2.5 million a year for 18, 19, and 20, and then potentially new bond authorization in 2018 for $45 million. We'd sell the bonds all in one series in order to meet the construction cash flows. Often if you have a bond authorization, depending on the project, you don't need the money right away. We'd sell it in two series. For example, that's what I believe we did back in 2007 when we financed the last project. We actually had two different bond sales. Or no, let me take that back. We were looking at two bond sales, but we rolled it into one because we were able to put the money in the construction projects fund, make a little bit of interest earnings for you at that point. We're looking at current interest rates plus 1.5%. We have to make an assumption of what interest rates are going to do as well, along with your assessed value. Nobody really knows what interest rates are going to do, but we want to try to be conservative on some of these numbers. So interest rates have been rising quite a bit lately, especially since the election in November. But they stabilized over the holidays, and we're hoping that we see a little bit more stabilization here over the coming year once everybody kind of gets their arms around the geopolitical environment here. So that, again, we added 1.5% to the current interest rates. Right now, for example, you'd be at a 3.6, 3.7% on a bond issue. So 1.5% on top of that, it's almost a 50% increase in interest rates. But rates can move quickly. So again, we're hoping we're being conservative, but it's hard to say. And then if on the bond option, we'd have a 21-year maximum term. So going into some of the numbers, here we get into some real small numbers, and I hope you can read them. And that's why I like my PDF, because I can zoom in on them. But maybe, Gina, the best thing to do would be to flip to the next page. Just has the graph and focus on that. And you'll see this is a graph of your tax rates, including the capital levy and the bond authorization. So the blue bar being the existing debt, the green, the first one on the lower, is your M&O levy. The yellow bar would be the capital levy for 3 years. And then the bond would be the orange bar on top of that. And you can see this presents a problem here, or potential problem, I would say, with the increase in the tax rates for those 2 years. So how do we get around that? And really the only way to get around that, I think, would be to delay a bond issue until the 2020 timeframe authorization. You'd sell bonds, the first debt service would be 2021. If we contrast that to...
I had a question there.
Yes.
Can't we pass the bond authorization without selling any bonds till 2020? Can't we still sell it in 2018 to the public and then not spend any money into 2020?
Yes, you could do that. I've not seen that done. I've seen it done where we'll have a bond authorization, say a large authorization, and you'll spread it out over 3 or 4 years. The challenge may be that if people are expecting, things to be done sooner, but I'm assuming the capital levy would be those things you tell them you're doing it up first.
Yeah,
so
I guess my understanding with the building of especially a big project like this is it was going to take us 18 to 24 months before we spent a lot of money anyway. But maybe I was misunderstanding other meetings we've been in. By the time you get all the funding and the architect stuff done, and is that right, Gina?
Okay, so if we passed a bond in 2018, probably a year of, depending on what we're designing, but a year of design before it goes out to bid. And so we'd be looking at probably 12 to 16 months before we started spending any money.
Yeah, so I just, because you're assuming the whole 45 million is the $1.61, right, in 2019?
I'm sorry, say that again.
The bond rate in 2019 is assuming the whole 45 million, right?
Right, if it was all sold in one issuance. Is that correct, Mark?
Yes, yes, it is. And what we would do is once you have the authorization, we'd get a projected construction cash flow, and then just make sure that we're funding it as needed. And so if you didn't need the money, then we could delay the issuance of all or a portion of the bonds. It's usually a balance between paying the interest. Often districts want to lock in interest rates if they can earlier on a financing. But yes, you're exactly right that we wouldn't sell debt and incur debt and sell bonds until you needed the money. So that is exactly right. So we could delay the bond sales and move those out to those years. So you could have an authorization, approve them both at the same time, as an example, and then move that sale out later.
And then Gina, is that the operating levy tax, the $2.32, is that assuming the levy passes? Because I'm surprised it stays the same. I thought it went up on our.
Well, it did. I actually didn't. Yeah. Currently, we pay $2.39. It's gone up to $2.40 for 2018, $2.44, and $2.48 based on our current.
32 numbers are wrong in here then.
They're based on probably the 2014-16.
Yeah, that's an older number. Gina, I should have gotten that from you. Probably the new levy amounts, and we can put those into the model as well.
Mark, quick question is a comment you made earlier, and I thought I had read recently, and it surprised me because I didn't know about this, that you could have 30-year bonds. Is that not true? You said 21's as long as you can go.
No, under state law, you could actually go 40 years.
Oh, okay.
He said
And
usually 25.
the longest I've seen for Washington School District is 25. And it's a balance, as you know, just as when you finance your home, between your payment amount and your interest cost. And so in this case, for example, the early years when you'd have this capital levy set, I'd structured that bond issue so it's interest only in those first couple of years. So if you stretch it out longer, it'd actually make your tax rate a little bit higher because interest costs would be higher for those early years. So if you believe you won't be borrowing for quite a while, then, like for example, I just did a project for Woodland School District where they built a new high school and they know that's the largest project they're going to do for quite some time. And so that's a 25-year bond issue. The most common is 2021. I use 21 because kind of did a little technicality. Bonds in Washington typically mature in December with payments of interest in June and December because that matches your tax collection cycle for property taxes. So you make the big payment at the end of the year. But if you pass a spring authorization, typically people want to sell bonds in June. So you're either going to have a 19.5-year issue or a 20.5-year issue. So I usually just say 21 years to give you that ability to spread it out at least to 20 years. And maybe to contrast this, it'd be the easiest thing to rather than focus on the smaller numbers, we can go into those as well. Just go to the second graph. Gina, would be just a bond issue only at 45 million. And you can see that moves to the 166 and stays there. And steps down into the future. So it may be a question of, the projects you're considering with the capital levy, would they fit within that bond authorization? Would you need a larger authorization to increase that as your debt capacity increases into the future? Or, as you suggested, to request a bond authorization, but not sell bonds for a couple of years until the capital levy were to be paid off. Then it would go to the essentially $1, 66, 68, 67, somewhere in there for your capital facilities funding, and then continue on through that rate after the capital levy were to expire.
So $45 million bond will not build us a new high school. Gina probably explained that we're looking at a couple phases. So
yes,
what I'm wondering is I'm really curious about the next one, the next phase. Because without that, we can't do what we're talking about doing anyway.
Yeah, maybe that one would be addressed in when we talk about the debt capacity analysis. Gina, if you move back to the table and see when you'd have, we're saying in 2018 you'd have 45 million. 2022, for example, you have $62 million in debt capacity. And again, this is assuming a 4% growth in your assessed value, and you're paying your bonds off as you currently are. So that's one of the things that I've been talking to Gene about, some of these different options for at least, the better part of a year now, I think. And the one that we always kind of bump up against is the debt capacity.
So this table on slide 12 is what was Mark provided last year for facility planning. So, and there was the different scenarios that were being discussed by the planning committee at that time. There was also some state match dollars. I don't remember right off the top of my head how much. They weren't huge dollars. But so if you're looking kind of for a correlation between why we were looking at a phased high school, is we were looking at the increased debt capacity over time to build the phased high school.
Yeah, no, yeah, I understand. Just looking at this though, what I'm curious is, whatever year it might be, 2022, 2023, what would another $45 million bond, well, not even 45 because that would be over the debt capacity, but a bond that would be then proposed that maxes our debt capacity, what does that look like for taxpayers? Because right now, it just shows us that one being paid out till the end of it in 2040 or whatever it is. Does that make sense what I'm asking? Because we had talked about originally the second phase being 5 years after the first phase, right? So in this case, potentially that becomes 2023 or 2025 if we delay the sale of the bonds. So if you look at this graph, 2025 or 2023, you're going to add another, I don't know, these 2018 bonds are $2.68. Maybe another $2 on top of that would be my
One of the things I'd add, if we're looking at the graph with the capital levy and bonds with the hump in there for 2020, if you didn't have a bond authorization in place right then, would be the time I'd say that's the time you really want to go to voters, because without it, your tax rate would actually be dropping. In 2020, you could go to the voters and say you could approve a $45 million bond issue with essentially no tax increase. So if what you're doing is say you need a $60 million authorization, knowing you're going to sell them over a 3-year period of time, and when your assessed value grows and you have debt capacity, then it may be a 20-cent increase or something like that rather than a 70-cent increase. I'm just making those numbers up, but magnitude wise, that's the time that it provides a nice step down in your tax rate.
Yeah, I don't think I understood that.
He actually was just reiterating what the purpose or what the thinking behind the capital levy from the board was to if the community was in favor of it, bring the tax rate up and you get your bond passed before it drops back down. So
You
that's
can almost structure it so that it's heavier up front, then the other bond comes in 5 years later, and maintains. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah, the local funding on the last one that we looked at was 68 million of the 84 million. The step one that we got,
About 18 million in state match.
yeah, 15 million.
Okay, I see you again now. Sorry about that.
600,000.
I'm guessing Underwood, Washington doesn't have the best internet capability.
Mark, I think you need to push the video button on your end so that we can see you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So I'm not sure if you caught the last bit that I was talking about, but when you have if we look at the graph where you have the capital levy and the bond, 2020 would be a natural time if you didn't have a bond authorization in place to ask for voter authorization, because your tax rate would be dropping after the capital levy expires. And you could then say that you could have a $45 million issue, for example, with no tax rate increase from what they were currently paying. Or if it was a $60 million authorization, maybe it's a 20-cent increase or something smaller than you'd be looking at any otherwise.
Well, what I'm also interested in is knowing then what it looks like when the next, not the initial bond, but the next phase as our debt capacity increases, we'd be probably asking for a second bond. And I don't know, I know we have options to ask for all the money up front, but then not issue bonds until later on when we get debt capacity. But that's what I'm missing here, is being able to see what's that look like on a 20-year amortization with two different bond sales like that.
Okay, I know we've looked at that one time before, Gina, but I'd want to look at that again and add that in, and it would essentially be you'd look at, okay, do we want to make it step up, two different steps, for example, one for the first authorization, or step up, and then one for the second authorization, or would you want to bring it up right away to what you think is going to be long term? Typically, what people are going to do is want two steps, so it's a separate authorization for each one. But we can model out and say, if we have an amount that 5 years from now or whatever, you believe we'd be doing, if Gina gives me the numbers and the dates, and I can put together a similar set of analysis with those to get to you.
Okay. Now, I understand what you're saying about different ways to look at it. Either the big jump at first and then maintain that when you get the second bond, or two bumps, right?
Right.
Part of the budget still is over the debt capacity. That's the next question.
Well, we do if it's at 67 million, that's net.
But we'll have 62 million in 2022. And 66 million in 2023.
Part of this capital projects levy, my thoughts were with that was that you then, if we did a $7.5 million levy, you've pulled that out of the overall project, and so you have 7.5 million toward that one for in case the debt capacity is lower. Because levies don't count toward debt capacity, correct, Mark?
That's correct. I should probably mention as well that with the capital levy, of course, you collect the taxes over time, so you really wouldn't have the money to do that project until the end of the third year.
We would have the possibility of front funding it, though. I believe that's what we talked about.
Yes, and that the front funding option would be with non-voted debt. And that's where we talked a little bit about the fact that you can't pay interest with capital levy dollars, which you could probably figure out a way around that with existing revenue sources. But the big one is you can't use non-voted debt for new construction.
Correct, but if
So
we already
that's
have,
where your fund
if we already have
council
the,
would,
if we already have the cash in
say,
our
well,
capital account, we don't have to borrow any money from anywhere. We can front fund it with our own money. Self-funding is probably what Rob's talking about instead of front funding it. We were talking about self-funding it with our capital operating money that we already have.
Okay, gotcha. And then replenishing that with the capital
Correct.
levy. So in any of these things, the kind of the structure, how you'd repay it, of course, I'd want to run it by your bond counsel, make sure it's all legal, and if we're transferring money, that it works within all the, different state regulations. But it sounds like that would work. So I think that, the last slide I have was just on next steps, and I think they're fairly obvious. Look at your project scope and the costs associated with them, and evaluate the timing of the construction cash flow as we talked about. Determine the capital levy collection amounts that you'd be receiving and match that up against your construction cash flow. Then look at the best method of funding these different projects, bonds versus capital levies or other sources, impact fees, those sorts of things. Then we look at refining the taxpayer cost, and including in that, for example, then adding on the next authorization. So we have a long-term plan, and do we want to build in a step somewhere 5 years in the future or something like that for another bond authorization, or include one large bond authorization, sell them over time. Work with the bond counsel to look at drafting election resolutions, and for the April 2017 election, you're looking at a February 24th deadline to file an election resolution, which is a fairly short time frame, I think, at this point. I haven't talked with your bond counsel, but I know Jim McNeil is very thorough and can do things quickly. Just need to keep him in the loop on what's going on as well.
Does the board have any other questions for Mark?
Okay, I think you've addressed all the questions, and we appreciate your time and presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to, apologize for the technical issues here, but as some of you, I think I put generally around 30 to 40,000 miles a year in a car. This is my first video conferencing meeting. Of course, it wasn't perfect. I was actually more nervous doing this than standing in front of you and doing a presentation. So my television debut, but I'm probably not going to go for the networks anytime soon. And, appreciate having the chance to work with you. And Dr. Hurst, looking forward to meeting you as well soon.
Likewise.
Thanks, Mark, for
Thanks,
all
Mark.
your time and presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all.
Thanks. Take care.
So as I'm looking at page 19 on this presentation, it talks about the next steps. So I'm not sure if do we need to make, as a board, any requests?
I think the next step is to set up a board authorized committee to get some community member input and find out what the community wants. If the community doesn't want a sports complex, then none of this really matters. There's not a lot of reason to pursue it. If we get a committee together and that's not the recommendation they give us. I think you had requested that we all bring some names, right, for the committee?
So, do we think we can get this committee formed and have enough meetings to get enough feedback by February 24th? Before the 24th, because we're trying to get the rest of the steps taken care of.
So that's a great question, and I'm just not sure that I have an answer. But if and it sounds like, I think I've talked to a few board members, and it doesn't sound like we all have 5 names that have confirmed that they would be a part of a committee. And so if we're going to take longer than to establish some sort of a good committee, then my question to the board is, should we move on with trying to form a committee with a certain amount of members and trying to get in how many meetings before the 24th?
I think we need to determine what the purpose of the committee is first.
Okay.
To gauge community support on a athletic complex, isn't it? Or to have isn't that what we always have any kind of facilities committee, is to talk about needs
Well,
athletic
are we going
complex?
to do it that way, or are we going to do it as
If we've already decided as a board, there's no reason to get a committee.
or is the committee going to come back with recommendations to us, like what the sports complex should?
It would be all of that, from my view. I mean, the risk, if the board's just going to say this is what we already think the community wants, we can go to the voters, but you have a lot less support because we haven't involved as many people.
Can we get all that done, though, Director Ashton, in 2 or
Doesn't-
3 meetings?
To me, that's a moot point. It will get more done if we form a committee now than we will if we wait until next month to form a committee.
And I think that's my question is, you obviously have an idea what the committee would be, but we as a board have to determine what the committee's purpose would be. We have to follow our format based on policy. And until we make that decision, then it's hard to say. And I don't even know if we say, these are the days you will meet. We say, here's the task, here's what we need to have an answer by, and let the committee decide how they need to meet.
Yeah, I guess from my view, I'm not sure it's going to take them 5 meetings to figure out what direction that we need to go. It's not like we're building an $80 million school. We're talking about whether we want to put in a sports complex or not.
So am I hearing from you, you're saying that kind of a dual purpose for the committee? First, to determine, is this something that is important for this community? Number two, then, what would the scope of it be?
Correct.
What, if it's either $5 million or 7.5, this is what each would get us. 5 million would almost pay what the city wants for their improvements. So we'd still owe them 200,000, right, on that one? But is that what you're saying, to have kind of two purposes? That's the first task, and if they say, yep, this is something we can do, then the next task would be, what would the scope be?
But the third scope, the third question though is, what is the city going to require? So if we go for a $7.5 million
Complex, yeah.
levy, is 5 million of it going to go to the city, or is it, or 5 million is going to go to the complex? I'm gonna have that question answered also.
I think that has to be something that happens separate from that. I mean, if the committee comes in the end and says, yeah, we want to do this, and here's what we say, well, you can't afford it then.
Right, but you're right, so that's not the committee's, on their scope, but it's gonna be somebody's scope, because that's gonna affect what the committee's response about, maybe we have to prioritize. We can just look at the budget.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at a $5 million bill for the city, it's
About 3 city council members on this committee, so
down at least.
Right. So I'm looking for, we have about 3 more minutes. I'm looking for direction from the board is to continue with the board committee.
I personally want to continue with the board committee. I don't know if we're going to get it there.
By the 24th.
It might be the next time. We can try it. Let's see if we should try it. But at least let's get it going, and let's start doing the communication back and forth between themselves and the community, and between them and us. And some feedback. Wasn't the timing of this where you wanted to run it at the same time as the M&O?
No, we can't run it at the same time as M&O, no matter what we did. That we would have to have it in December.
So one of the things too is that it would need to be a formal board action to set up the committee, right?
Right.
So if this is something we decide we want to do, we need to add it to our agenda tonight, and then also, as a board, come up with what the purpose will be. Otherwise, we're talking about 2 weeks down the road before we even have the purpose of the committee.
So I've heard in our discussion at least 2 purposes for establishing this committee, maybe possibly 3. Is there any other purpose for establishing this committee, board
Well,
committee?
to me, I don't think the city problems are really between the board and the city. I don't think that really has anything to do with the committee. We're not going to ask the committee to go talk to city council or talk to the city planner or any of that stuff.
So it's still two.
Okay.
Well, but
To me, the dollars is for the board.
I think Stuart made a good point, though, that if the committee thinks they have $6 million to work with to figure out what they want, and in reality they have $3 million, that's going to change things. So probably the idea of prioritizing is a good idea, but that's how we need to word then what the task of the committee is. Is it going to be to determine what it's going to be, and here's the money, or what are your priority list of what you'd like to see? Then, based on how much money we have, we can figure out what we'll be able to do.
That makes better
There's going to be
sense to me.
some that are non-negotiables. You have to do it no matter what facilities you put in. Some things have to be done, like some infrastructure stuff.
Okay.
But I think the priority is
Okay.
that's how we have to word it that way.
Okay. So we'll move on, and then if somebody can amend our agenda at our next meeting so that we can have this discussion, so that a motion can be made and establish a committee, and then we'll talk about names at that point. Is that consensus from the board? Okay. It is 7 o'clock. We are finished with our workshop, and we will move right into our regular board meeting. And just give me a minute here.
Can we maybe start the meeting and go into a recess for?
Okay, we'll recess for,
We have to start.
Start it first.
Oh, okay. so it's, hold on, trying to get to the meeting here. Okay, so we will call our regular board meeting to order. It's about 7:01 or so, and we will request a 4-minute recess, and then come back into the meeting at about 7:05. Do I need to